It was an ordinary Tuesday when the letter arrived. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my small, cluttered kitchen as I sipped my coffee, going through the usual stack of mail, bills, coupons, and junk. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for one envelope. It was thick, off-white, with no return address. The name on it wasn't mine. It was addressed to my neighbor, Daniel Crow, from across the street. Daniel wasn't exactly a mystery, but he wasn't well known either. A middle-aged man with an unremarkable demeanor, he moved into the neighborhood about a year ago. He kept to himself, polite but distant, the type of person whose absence would be noticed only after weeks. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I turned the envelope over in my hands, the faintest twinge of guilt building as I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. What I found inside was strange, to say the least. The contents were handwritten instructions, precise and technical, accompanied by rough diagrams. At first glance, it looked like something out of an engineer's notebook. The notes described how to construct a device using common materials, pipes, cables, and weights. But as I read further, a chilling realization dawned: it wasn't a machine for utility or art. It was a trap. A human trap. The designs were meticulous. There were detailed explanations of pressure points, bait placement, and escape prevention mechanisms. The instructions even specified how to conceal the device once it was operational. My stomach turned as I reread the lines, hoping I had misunderstood. But the details were unmistakable. This wasn't a prank or a mistake. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. What the hell is this? I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My first thought was to dismiss it. Maybe it was some sort of creative writing project or a prop for a play. But why would Daniel Crow, my quiet, reclusive neighbor, receive something like this? And why was it in my mailbox? For a moment, I considered calling the police. But what would I say? That I had opened someone else's mail and found some weird designs? I'd probably end up explaining more about my nosiness than the letter itself. Besides, I had no proof of any wrongdoing. Instead, I decided to keep an eye on Daniel. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to my neighbor's comings and goings. His routine seemed ordinary: morning jogs, grocery trips, and quiet evenings with the blinds drawn. But at night, something was different. The faint hum of machinery drifted from his house, audible only in the dead silence of post-midnight hours. Lights flickered in his basement window, sharp and sporadic, like welding sparks. Once, I even saw him unloading long, unmarked boxes from the back of his truck. He moved quickly, glancing around as if worried someone might be watching. I ducked behind my curtains, my pulse quickening. The letter's contents echoed in my mind, mingling with the paranoia that had been growing since the day it arrived. My curiosity became an obsession. I started documenting everything. Notes, timestamps, and even blurry pictures from my phone. The more I observed, the clearer it became: Daniel Crow wasn't who he claimed to be. But what could I do with this knowledge? One evening, I decided to test the waters. Under the pretense of returning a misdelivered package, I walked up to his door. The late autumn wind bit at my face as I stood on his porch, rehearsing my lines. When Daniel opened the door, he looked surprised but composed. "Hey," I said, holding up the package. "This got dropped at my place by mistake." He took the box, glancing at the label before giving me a tight-lipped smile. "Thanks. Happens all the time, doesn't it?" "Yeah, no problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "By the way, everything okay? I've noticed a lot of late-night activity. Figured you might be working on something interesting." For a moment, his expression faltered. It was brief, but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed, and the corners of his mouth tightened before he quickly recovered. "Just some projects for work," he said. "Deadlines, you know how it is." I nodded, pretending to accept his explanation. But the encounter only fueled my suspicions. There was something in his tone, a guarded edge that hinted at secrets he didn't want anyone to uncover. The letter haunted me. I'd taken to hiding it in the back of a drawer, but its existence weighed on my mind. What if Daniel wasn't just an eccentric loner? What if he was dangerous? Late one night, I sat in my living room, staring at the envelope. A faint tapping sound came from the direction of Daniel's house. I pulled back the curtain and peered into the darkness. The silhouette of a figure moved near his backyard, carrying what looked like a large sack. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and debated whether to call the police. But fear paralyzed me. What if I was wrong? What if Daniel noticed me watching? Instead, I did nothing. I watched as the figure disappeared into the basement and the door closed behind them. The tapping stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. Whatever Daniel Crow was doing, it wasn't normal. It wasn't safe. And I had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The following night, I resolved to get closer to the truth. My camera, notebook, and flashlight sat ready on my dining table. I spent the day psyching myself up, telling myself that I wasn't crazy. Daniel's behavior was too bizarre to be innocent. When the sun set, I watched his house with renewed intensity. Around midnight, the basement light flickered on. My heart raced as I saw Daniel's shadow moving behind the curtain. This time, he was carrying what looked like a toolkit. For nearly an hour, the flickering light and occasional hum of machinery continued. Finally, the light went out, and his silhouette disappeared. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of my house, heart pounding in my chest. Staying in the shadows, I made my way to the side of Daniel's house. I crouched near the basement window, careful not to make a sound. The window was small, but it offered a partial view of the room below. What I saw made my blood run cold. A table stood in the center of the basement, covered in tools and materials eerily similar to the ones described in the letter. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor was marked with strange stains. My flashlight beam caught a large metal contraption in the corner. It matched one of the diagrams from the letter almost perfectly. My breath hitched as I spotted something worse, a small, bloodied glove on the floor near the table. Its size suggested it belonged to a child. My stomach churned as I imagined the possible horrors that could have unfolded here. I stumbled backward, trying to process what I had seen. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real. And it was dangerous. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the window. Daniel was standing in the basement, staring up at the window. My heart stopped as his eyes seemed to meet mine. I scrambled away, tripping over a loose rock. When I looked back, the window was dark. I barely made it back to my house, locking the door behind me and collapsing against it. My mind raced with questions. Had he seen me? Did he know I was watching? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like a breath on my neck. By morning, I was a wreck. But one thing was clear, I couldn't handle this alone. I called the police later that day, reporting my suspicions without revealing the letter or my nighttime snooping. 2 officers arrived within an hour. They listened patiently as I described the strange noises, the late-night activity, and the odd smells. They promised to investigate, and I watched from my window as they knocked on Daniel's door. He answered quickly, smiling as he spoke to the officers. They were inside for less than 15 minutes before they emerged, shaking hands with Daniel and heading back to their car. One of the officers stopped by my house on the way out, assuring me that they'd found nothing suspicious. "Just some tools and a workshop," he said. "Your neighbor's a handyman, it seems. Nothing out of the ordinary." I nodded, but my stomach churned. They hadn't looked closely enough. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. And now Daniel knew I'd sent them. The next few days were a nightmare. I felt his eyes on me constantly. When I walked to my car, when I mowed the lawn, even through the curtains at night. The hum of machinery became louder, more persistent, as if you were daring me to act. One night, I found a note slipped under my front door. In bold, shaky handwriting, it read, "Mind your own business." I'd tried the proper channels, and they'd failed. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to find it myself. And that meant going back into his house. The night was eerily silent when I made my move. Every window in Daniel's house was dark, and no light spilled from the basement. I clutched the crowbar I had brought with me, its cold steel comforting against my sweaty palms. My heart pounded as I crossed the street, each step amplifying the sense of inevitability. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was about survival. Something dark and malevolent was lurking, and I had to confront it. I circled to the back of the house, where the basement storm doors stood ajar. A faint breeze carried a metallic tang that made me shiver. I pried the doors open with the crowbar, the creak of hinges cutting through the oppressive quiet. Peering inside, I saw a narrow staircase descending into shadow. The faint hum of machinery was gone, replaced by a silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. I hesitated, gripping the crowbar tighter. A part of me screamed to turn back, to run, to forget everything I had seen. But the image of the bloodied glove flashed in my mind, and I pushed forward. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder, carrying the stench of rust and something else I couldn't place. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. In the center of the room, the contraption loomed. It was larger than I had imagined, a nightmarish amalgamation of metal and wire. Chains dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently as if disturbed by an unseen force. A table nearby was covered with tools, some of them rusted, others gleaming with a sinister sharpness. And then I saw them. In the far corner, a row of cages. Inside, figures huddled, too still, their forms barely discernible in the dim light. My stomach churned as I realized they were people. Some were motionless, their eyes wide and unseeing. Others stirred weakly, their movements sluggish and pained. The air was filled with a low, mournful whimper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh my God," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move closer. "Help," one of them rasped, a woman with hollow cheeks and matted hair. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried a weight that crushed my chest. Before I could respond, a sound froze me in place, the creak of a floorboard above. Daniel was home. I ducked behind the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door at the top of the stairs opened, and heavy footsteps descended. Daniel's silhouette appeared, his form blocking the light from above. He carried something large over his shoulder, a sack that shifted unnervingly as he moved. I bit down on a scream as he dropped the sack onto the floor. It landed with a sickening thud, and a muffled groan escaped from inside. Daniel turned, his eyes scanning the room, and for a terrifying moment, they lingered on my hiding spot. "I know you're here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed out of this." I held my breath, gripping the crowbar so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to survive. Above all, I knew one thing: I wasn't leaving this basement without a fight. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as Daniel's footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. He moved with a deliberate calm, each step seeming to draw him closer to my hiding place. The room's dim light danced off the cruel metal tools on the table above me, their sharp edges gleaming like fangs in the dark. I couldn't let him find me. Not like this. I shifted my grip on the crowbar, its weight grounding me against the rising tide of panic. My mind raced through scenarios, each more desperate than the last. I had no choice but to act. As Daniel's shadow stretched across the floor, I sprang from my hiding spot with a guttural yell, swinging the crowbar with all my strength. The blow connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a grunt of pain. His sack tumbled to the ground, spilling its contents, a barely conscious man, bound and gagged, his face pale and bloodied. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "You shouldn't have done that," he growled, his voice low and venomous. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched like claws. I swung the crowbar again, but this time he was ready. He caught the weapon mid-swing, wrenching it from my grasp with terrifying strength. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my mind scrambling for a plan. The cages rattled as their occupants stirred, their faint moans adding to the chaos. Daniel advanced, his movements predatory and controlled. I grabbed a wrench from the table and swung wildly, desperation lending strength to my blows. The wrench struck his arm, eliciting a snarl of pain, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He grabbed me by the collar, slamming me against the wall with enough force to knock the air from my lungs. "You have no idea what you've walked into," he hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath was hot and sour, his eyes alight with a twisted fury. "This isn't about you." It never was. Summoning every ounce of strength, I brought my knee up, catching him in the stomach. He doubled over, releasing his grip just enough for me to slip free. I scrambled toward the table, my hands searching frantically for anything I could use. My fingers closed around a heavy hammer, and I turned just in time to see Daniel charging at me. With a primal scream, I swung the hammer. The sickening crunch of impact reverberated through the room as it connected with his head. Daniel collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. I stood there, panting, the hammer slipping from my grasp as the weight of what I'd done crashed over me. The room was silent, save for the faint whimpers from the cages. I turned to the captives, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the locks. "It's okay," I murmured, my voice shaking. "You're safe now." But as I freed the last of them, a new sound filled the air, the wail of approaching sirens. My chest tightened as I realized what this meant. The police had arrived. They would find Daniel's body. They would find the captives. And they would find me. I backed away from the group, my mind reeling. I couldn't explain this. I couldn't prove that I wasn't part of it. Panic overtook me, and before I knew it, I was running. I fled the basement, the night swallowing me whole as I disappeared into the shadows. Behind me, the sirens grew louder, their mournful cry echoing in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that my life would never be the same. The days that followed were a blur. I moved through them like a ghost, haunted by the images etched into my mind, the bloodied glove, the hollow faces in the cages, and the lifeless stare of Daniel Crow as he lay crumpled on the floor. Sleep became a distant memory, and every shadow seemed to carry his mocking voice. The news broke 2 days later. The headlines were damning: local handyman found dead in basement with grisly secrets unveiled. The police had uncovered the horror I had fled, and the details spilled onto every channel and newspaper. But the coverage never mentioned me. The story was framed as if Daniel's death was an accident during some grotesque setup. The survivors, while rescued, remained tight-lipped about their ordeal, likely too traumatized to recall anything useful. I stayed in my house, paralyzed by fear and guilt. I couldn't bring myself to reach out to the police, to explain my side of the story. How could I? There was no proof of my innocence, only my frantic flight from the scene. My actions, however justified, had bound me to the horrors I had witnessed. Every creak of my house brought fresh waves of panic. I boarded up my windows, afraid to face the world outside. When I finally ventured out for groceries, the whispers followed me. My neighbors cast curious, wary glances, their hushed voices carrying just enough for me to piece together their theories. Somehow, they knew I had been involved, even if the police hadn't called me in. I tried to move on, to pretend life could go back.